Photography arrived in the 1820s. By the 1850s, it had become commonplace across Europe and North America. Thousands of images were captured daily: street scenes, labor crews, military units, family portraits. These photographs survive. They sit in archives, collections, and museum basements. They have not deteriorated beyond recognition. The emulsion has held. The images remain. And yet, something stops. In photographs dated before approximately 1850, individuals of extraordinary height appear with notable frequency. Not in circus settings, not in exhibition halls. They appear standing beside standard height companions in work crews. They appear in military formations. They appear in family groupings, dressed in ordinary clothing, engaged in ordinary tasks. The photographic record shows them as integrated members of society. Then, within a narrow window of time, they disappear from the record entirely. This is not a gradual fade. Photographs do not slowly lose their tall subjects over decades. The cessation is abrupt. By the 1860s and 1870s, such individuals are absent from the everyday photographic documentation of life. The historical record does not show a decline. It shows a cutoff. Consider the mechanics of photographic evidence. A daguerreotype captures what stood before the lens. It does not interpret. It does not editorialize. If a person measuring 7 feet stood beside a person measuring 5.5 feet, the plate records this proportional relationship with precision. Early photography was crude in many ways, but it was not blind to scale. The absence, then, is not a failure of the medium. It is a feature of the historical moment. Archives in Boston, Philadelphia, London, and Paris contain images from the 1840s showing work crews with height disparities that would be medically extraordinary today. A construction team photographed in 1847 outside a rail depot in Pennsylvania includes 2 men who tower over their companions, not by inches but by feet. They wear the same canvas work clothes. They hold the same tools. They are not staged. They are not celebrated. They are simply there. By 1875, such images have vanished. Medical records from the same period do not explain this disappearance. There is no documentation of a plague targeting individuals of exceptional height. There is no record of mass migration. There is no policy, no event, no disaster specifically cataloged as affecting this population. The historical narrative treats them as if they never existed in significant numbers at all, but the photographs remain. What we are left with is a void in the record that begins suddenly and continues to the present. The question is not whether these individuals existed. The photographic evidence confirms they did. The question is, what happened in the mid-19th century that removed them so completely from documented life? Photographs do not lie about presence, but they can be silent about absence, and this silence is total. Before we continue, if you're finding this investigation compelling, subscribe to follow this thread deeper, and leave a comment below. Let me know where you're watching from. This pattern appears globally. I want to know if you've seen evidence of it in your own region. The conventional explanation is medical. Gigantism, acromegaly, Marfan syndrome, conditions that produce extreme height in isolated individuals. The assumption is that any photograph showing a person of unusual stature documents a rare genetic disorder. This explanation is tidy. It is also incomplete, because they appear in groups. A photograph from 1843, archived in the Library of Congress, shows a lumber crew in upstate New York. 6 men stand in front of stacked timber. 3 of them are of standard height for the period, approximately 5 feet 6 inches to 5 feet 9 inches. 3 others are significantly taller, between 7 and 8 feet, based on proportional comparison to the timber dimensions which are documented in shipping records. All 6 men wear identical work attire. All 6 hold axes or saws. They are not posed. They are not labeled. They are a crew. Genetic anomalies do not cluster this way. Acromegaly occurs in roughly 3 to 4 cases per million individuals. The statistical probability of 3 cases appearing in a single 6-person work crew is functionally 0, and yet the photograph exists. This pattern repeats. A military regiment photographed in France in 1851 includes at least 4 soldiers who stand head and shoulders above their unit. A family portrait from Virginia, dated 1846, shows a father, mother, and 3 adult children, 2 of standard height, 1 towering over the others. The tall son is not isolated, he is integrated. The family poses naturally, without the rigid formality typically used to highlight physical difference. Architecture provides scale confirmation. Doorways in the 19th century were standardized for economic reasons. Lumber was milled to consistent dimensions, and doors were built to match. A standard door height in the 1840s was approximately 6 feet 6 inches. In photographs where these doors are visible, the tallest individuals often reach or exceed the doorframe. This is not distortion. The door is the constant. The height is the variable. What becomes clear is that these individuals were not treated as medical curiosities. They were not sequestered. They were not displayed. They were ordinary in the most unsettling sense. They participated in ordinary life. They worked. They served. They lived in families. The photographic record treats them as unremarkable. And that is what makes their disappearance so difficult to reconcile. If they were anomalies, their numbers were impossibly high. If they were not anomalies, then something fundamental about human population distribution has changed, and changed rapidly within a single generation. The medical explanation fails in the face of clustering. The demographic explanation fails in the face of timing. What remains is the evidence itself. Multiple individuals of extreme height, appearing together, engaged in ordinary labor and life, documented repeatedly until approximately 1850, and then gone. If they were ordinary then, why are they impossible now? There is another pattern in the historical record that shares the same temporal signature. It involves not people, but buildings. Specifically, it involves the ground level of buildings. Across multiple continents, cities show a consistent phenomenon. Streets that have been raised, ground floors that have become basements, windows that now sit at ankle height. This is visible in Boston, Edinburgh, Seattle, Rome, and dozens of other urban centers. In some cases, the burial is attributed to landfill projects or infrastructure improvements. In others, no explanation exists in municipal records. The timing is suggestive. In Seattle, after the fire of 1889, the city rebuilt streets 1 story higher than the original ground level. The official narrative attributes this to tidal flooding concerns. But the decision buried the original storefronts entirely, leaving them as underground passages, now called the Seattle Underground. Photographs from before the rebuild show a functional street level. Photographs from after show a completely different elevation. In Galveston, Texas, after the hurricane of 1900, the city raised the entire town by as much as 17 feet using dredged sand. Thousands of buildings were lifted on jacks. Streets were buried and reformed at a new elevation. The project took 7 years. The official reason: storm surge prevention. But the scale of the operation was extraordinary, a complete re-leveling of a city. These are documented events. They have explanations. But the pattern extends far beyond places with recorded disasters. In cities across Europe and North America, ground-level windows are now below grade. Buildings show clear evidence of a first floor that has been submerged. Doors have been bricked over. Staircases descend from what should be the entrance level. And critically, there is no municipal record of deliberate burial in many of these cases.
The buildings simply exist in a state that suggests a dramatic change in street elevation, without documentation of when or why it occurred. The synchronization is the problem. If this were a gradual process, the result of centuries of sediment accumulation or incremental urban planning, the changes would be visible over time in historical records. But photographs from the 1840s show ground floors at street level. Photographs from the 1880s show the same buildings partially buried. The window is narrow. The change is widespread.
And it aligns almost precisely with the disappearance of extremely tall individuals from photographic records. Two patterns, one timeline. The mudflood hypothesis proposes a global or regional catastrophic event involving massive displacement of sediment, whether from flooding, earthquake, or some other mechanism that buried infrastructure rapidly. The hypothesis is dismissed in mainstream historical scholarship, largely because no singular global event is recorded in the mid-19th century that would account for such widespread burial. But the infrastructure changes are real, the photographic evidence is real, and the timing is consistent. If a catastrophe occurred that was significant enough to bury buildings across multiple continents, it would have affected populations. Infrastructure does not vanish without human consequence. Cities do not re-level themselves without displacement, death, and demographic disruption. And yet, the human cost of such an event is absent from the historical record. What if the catastrophe erased not just the ground level of cities, but the people who existed at that scale? Certain buildings from the 19th century and earlier defy simple categorization. They are often labeled as civic monuments, government buildings, or exhibition halls. But their design features suggest function beyond aesthetics. Consider the architectural elements that repeat across these structures. Metal spires and finials that extend far above the roofline, often topped with metal spheres or star patterns. Extensive basement spaces with vaulted ceilings and metal plumbing that seems over-engineered for drainage alone. Windows placed at unusual intervals, often aligned with geometric precision. And internal spaces that are scaled larger than necessary for typical human use. Doorways that exceed 8 feet. Ceilings that soar to 15 or 20 feet in rooms that served no grand ceremonial purpose. These buildings are found worldwide. They share design languages despite being separated by thousands of miles. And they were constructed in a period, late 18th to mid-19th century, when architectural communication across continents was limited. The official designation for many of these structures is Beaux-Arts or neoclassical, styles that emphasize grandeur and historical reference. But the functional elements resist purely aesthetic explanation. The metal spires, for example, are often connected to internal metal frameworks that run through the building's structure. In some cases, these frameworks terminate in basement rooms lined with metal or ceramic. This configuration is consistent with atmospheric electrical systems, structures designed to capture, conduct, or distribute electrical charge. Nikola Tesla's later work on wireless power transmission described similar architectural principles: tall conductive spires, grounded basements, resonant cavities. But these buildings predate Tesla's public work by decades. There are no manuals, no schematics in municipal archives explaining their operation. The buildings exist, but the knowledge of how to use them, if they were indeed operational technologies, does not. What remains is architecture that suggests purpose without instructions. This is where scale becomes relevant. If these buildings were operational systems, perhaps for energy distribution, atmospheric processing, or some other function now obscure, they would have required operators, maintenance, monitoring, knowledge passed through direct training rather than written documentation, embodied expertise. And the buildings are scaled for tall operators. Doors that exceed 8 feet, do not serve a decorative purpose in a maintenance corridor. Ceiling heights of 15 feet in mechanical or basement rooms suggest accommodation for individuals who needed clearance to work. The infrastructure itself implies the presence of people who matched its proportions. When the extremely tall individuals disappear from the photographic record in the mid-19th century, the operational knowledge of these buildings also vanishes. The structures remain, but they are repurposed, converted into museums, government offices, or exhibition halls. Their original function, if it was technological, is forgotten or obscured. They become monuments to a past that is no longer understood. This suggests a sequence. Operational buildings exist, scaled for and maintained by individuals of exceptional height. A catastrophic event occurs. The operators vanish. The buildings fall silent. Subsequent generations interpret them as purely aesthetic achievements because the operational knowledge has been lost. The technology becomes misunderstood architecture, and the people who knew how to use it are gone. Historical records are not neutral. They are maintained, archived, and curated by institutions that make decisions about what is preserved and what is discarded. Census data, hospital records, military rosters, and burial registries are subject to loss through fire, flood, neglect, or deliberate destruction. But certain absences follow patterns that are harder to explain through accident alone. Census records from the mid-19th century in multiple countries show anomalies. In the United States, the 1870 census is notably incomplete, with entire counties in several states reporting data gaps. The official explanation is administrative failure during the post-Civil War period. But the gaps are not random. They cluster in regions where photographic evidence of tall individuals was previously documented. Hospital records from the same period show similar voids. In London, patient registries from St. Bartholomew's Hospital between 1845 and 1865 have significant sections missing or damaged. The explanation given is a storage facility fire in 1892. But other records from the same facility and storage location survived intact. The destroyed sections are selective. Military records present another pattern. Regimental rosters from the 1850s often survive, but individual service records, documents that would include physical descriptions, including height, are frequently absent. The French Foreign Legion's archives, for example, show this gap clearly. Rosters confirm the existence of certain units, but individual dossiers for those units are missing or incomplete. Then there are the photographs themselves. Archival photographs from the mid-19th century sometimes show signs of alteration, not crude forgery, but careful modification, cropping that removes individuals at the edges of group photos, rephotographing of original images at angles that compress or normalize scale. In some cases, photographs exist in multiple versions, an original that shows height disparities and a later archived copy that has been cropped or retouched to minimize those disparities. This is not universal, but it is present, and it suggests curation. What emerges is a pattern of coordinated silence, not in the sense of conspiracy, but in the sense of systematic omission. Records that would document the presence and sudden absence of a distinct population are incomplete, damaged, or missing. Photographs that show that population are altered or removed from prominent archives, and the historical narrative that emerges treats them as isolated anomalies rather than an integrated demographic. This level of coordination across multiple countries, institutions, and record-keeping systems is difficult to achieve through accident. It suggests intention. Whether that intention was to suppress evidence, to revise history, or simply to correct records that no longer matched post-catastrophe reality is unclear. But the effect is the same: erasure. Memory itself is constructed from records. When records are incomplete, memory becomes unreliable. Generations that follow lose access to what was known before. The past becomes uncertain, and uncertainty allows reinterpretation. If a catastrophic event did occur in the mid-19th century, one significant enough to bury infrastructure and eliminate a population, then the response may have included deliberate historical revision, not to hide the event itself, but to stabilize the narrative afterward, to prevent panic, to create continuity where there was rupture. This is not unprecedented. Governments and institutions have rewritten records after disasters throughout history. What makes this case unusual is the scale and the consistency. The erasure is not localized. It is global, and it has been remarkably successful. The danger is not just what was erased. It is the mechanism of erasure itself. If records can be altered, selectively destroyed, or curated to omit entire populations and events, then history is less stable than we assume. The past is not fixed.
It is maintained, and maintenance requires choice, which means the past can be unmade. If this was possible once, if a demographic could vanish from record, if infrastructure could be buried and reinterpreted, if memory itself could be revised across continents, then the mechanisms that allowed it still exist. And if they exist, they can be used again. The question is not just what happened. The question is, what prevents it from happening now?